The wind whistled softly through the trees as Jacob leaned against the worn wooden fence, his eyes scanning the endless stretch of farmland that had been in his family for generations. The golden hues of the setting sun painted long shadows over the fields, but all he could see were the cracks in the soil, the patches where the crops hadn't taken, the signs that the land, his land, was failing. It hadn't always been this way. His grandfather had built this farm with his bare hands, turning an empty plot of land into something that could sustain a family for decades. But times had changed. The soil wasn't as rich as it once was, and the debt hanging over his head had grown heavier with each passing season. The bank had sent another notice that morning, a final warning. If he didn't come up with a miracle soon, he would lose everything. Jacob exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck as he glanced toward the old barn at the edge of the property. It had stood there longer than he had been alive, a relic of the past, its wooden beams warped with time. His grandfather had spent hours inside that barn, tinkering, fixing equipment, storing tools, always with a cigarette dangling from his lips and a quiet look of contemplation in his eyes. There was a time when Jacob had thought of that place as a sanctuary, a space where problems could be solved with a little grease and hard work. Now, it just felt like a reminder of everything that was slipping through his fingers. He sighed, kicking a loose rock near his boot before turning toward the barn. Maybe he could fix some of the old equipment, sell off whatever he didn't need. It wouldn't be much, but it was better than nothing. He pushed open the doors, the hinges groaning under years of rust and neglect. Dust swirled in the air as he stepped inside, the familiar scent of oil, hay, and aged wood wrapping around him like a ghost of the past. Jacob had no idea that within these walls, hidden beneath years of dust and forgotten history, was the very thing that would change his life forever. Jacob took a slow, steady breath, his fingers tightening around the edges of the crate as he dragged it aside, revealing more of the worn wooden planks beneath. The dust swirled in the low light filtering through the barn's gaps, dancing like ghosts in the air. He swallowed hard, his throat dry, an uneasy weight settling in his chest. Something felt off, not just because he had found something unexpected, but because of the way the barn itself seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for him to uncover something best left undisturbed. Kneeling, he ran his fingers over the uneven floorboards, feeling for anything unnatural. His hand hesitated over a particular section where the grain of the wood didn't quite match the rest. He knocked once, solid, moved a few inches, knocked again, hollow. A slow chill crept up his spine. This barn had been standing longer than he had been alive. He had spent his childhood playing here, hiding in the lofts, helping his grandfather repair broken equipment. And yet, in all those years, he had never noticed this, never even suspected that something had been deliberately concealed beneath his feet. His pulse quickened as he reached for the crowbar leaning against the workbench, the worn handle rough against his palm. He wedged the metal edge into the narrow gap between the planks, applying pressure. The wood resisted at first, groaning under the strain, but then crack. The board splintered, lifting just enough for him to wedge his fingers beneath it. He hesitated, a flicker of uncertainty dancing at the edge of his mind. Then, with a sharp inhale, he pulled. The plank came free with a burst of dust and a dull clang as it struck something metal beneath. Jacob coughed, waving a hand in front of his face to clear the air, but his eyes remained locked on what lay before him. An iron safe. It was larger than he expected, its rusted surface covered in years of grime, the edges worn but still intact. The sight of it sent a strange unease crawling through him. There was something almost unnatural about how well it had been hidden, how deliberately it had been tucked away beneath the barn floor, buried beneath decades of dust and forgotten time. His fingers hovered over the rusted dial, tracing its rough surface. There were no markings, no engravings, just a heavy sealed door with a lock that had long since fused with age. His heartbeat thudded against his ribs as he took a step back, as if putting even the smallest distance between himself and the safe would lessen the weight of what he had just uncovered. His grandfather had never spoken about this. Not once. A man who had built this farm from nothing, who had worked tirelessly from sunrise to sunset, who had taught him that secrets only lead to regret, had been keeping one this whole time. Jacob's stomach twisted. He should leave it alone. Walk away. Pretend he never found it. Whatever was inside, it had been buried for a reason. But somehow, deep down, he already knew. There was no walking away from this. The past never stays buried. Jacob exhaled slowly, his breath uneven as he crouched before the iron safe, his fingers hovering just above the rusted dial. The barn felt eerily silent now. The usual creaks of settling wood and the distant rustling of leaves outside drowned out by the pounding of his own heartbeat. The safe was old, older than him, older than the barn itself, it seemed. The metal was rough with corrosion, patches of rust spreading across its surface like scars from another lifetime. The lock was heavy, the kind designed to keep something hidden, something that was never meant to be found. He tightened his jaw. His grandfather had never spoken about this, not once. Not when they spent long summers repairing the barn together. Not when they sat in the fields, watching the sun dip below the horizon, sharing quiet stories about the family's past. His grandfather had been a man of honor, of hard work, of sacrifice. So why had he buried this? Jacob ran a hand down his face, trying to push away the uneasy feeling settling deep in his chest. Whatever was inside, he needed to know. He tried the lock first, twisting the dial, hoping by some miracle it had been left open. It didn't budge. His fingers curled into fists. Of course it wouldn't be that easy. He scanned the barn, searching for something he could use to pry it open. His eyes landed on an old sledgehammer leaning against the wall, its wooden handle splintered from years of use. He grabbed it, feeling the familiar weight in his hands, his grip tightening. For a brief moment he hesitated. Did he really want to know? The past had a way of changing people. Once something was uncovered, there was no going back. But the farm was dying. His legacy was slipping through his fingers. Maybe, just maybe, whatever was inside this safe held the answer. A last, desperate chance to save everything. With a deep breath, he raised the sledgehammer above his head and swung. The first impact sent a deep, metallic clang echoing through the barn. Dust shook loose from the rafters. He swung again and again, each strike sending vibrations up his arms, the force rattling his bones. The lock groaned. Then, with a final ear-splitting crack, it snapped. The air around him felt heavy, as if the barn itself had been holding its breath for years, waiting for this very moment. His fingers trembled as he set the hammer down, the sound of metal against wood ringing in the silence. He reached forward, hesitating for only a second before gripping the edge of the safe's heavy door. It resisted at first, stuck from decades of neglect. Then, with a sharp pull, it lurched open. Jacob's breath caught in his throat. Inside, neatly stacked bundles of cash lay undisturbed, untouched by time. Old bills, faded but crisp, wrapped tightly in paper bands, the ink barely smudged despite the years. His mind reeled. Tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands, of dollars. More money than he had ever seen in his entire life. But just as his pulse began to race, his eyes landed on something else. Tucked among the stacks of money was an envelope, yellowed with age, the edges brittle and curling. His grandfather's handwriting stretched across the front, the ink faded but unmistakable. Jacob swallowed hard, his fingers brushing over the paper as a cold sense of dread curled in his stomach. His grandfather had left a message, and somehow, he knew the truth inside would be worth more than all the money in the world. Jacob stared at the envelope, his fingers hovering over the brittle paper, his breath caught somewhere between anticipation and dread. The safe should have been a blessing, a miracle even. The money inside could solve everything, could save the farm, could pull him back from the edge of financial ruin. But somehow, he couldn't look away from the envelope. It wasn't thick, no more than a few folded pages inside, but the weight of it was unbearable. His grandfather's handwriting, steady, deliberate, stared back at him. The ink had faded over time, but the name scrawled across the front was unmistakable. It wasn't his. Jacob's pulse hammered against his ribs. He had expected, maybe, a will, a forgotten deed, some kind of explanation for why the money had been hidden away. But this wasn't addressed to him. It was meant for someone else. His hands trembled as he slid a finger beneath the seal, peeling it open carefully as if whatever was inside might break apart at the slightest touch. He unfolded the paper, the delicate fibers crackling softly, and forced himself to read. If you are reading this, it means I never had the courage to do what was right. Jacob's chest tightened. I told myself I was protecting my family, that I had no choice. But we always have a choice, and I made the wrong one. I took something that was never mine, and because of that, a man lost everything. His eyes flicked back to the stacks of money inside the safe. He trusted me. He believed in me. And I betrayed him. When he left town, I told myself it was for the best, that he would rebuild, that he would survive. But I have lived with the weight of this for too long. I should have gone after him. I should have given it back. Jacob's mouth went dry. His grandfather had always been a man of integrity, a man who preached honesty and hard work. He had built this farm from nothing, raised a family, left behind a legacy that Jacob had spent his whole life trying to live up to. And yet that legacy was built on a lie. Jacob clenched his jaw, his fingers tightening around the paper. If he is still out there, this money belongs to him. It always did. His hands trembled. He could barely process the words. His grandfather, his hero, had stolen this money, and the man he had stolen it from, he had simply disappeared. Jacob's stomach twisted. He had spent years fighting to hold on to this farm, struggling against forces that felt bigger than him. And now, here it was, the answer to everything, hidden in the floorboards of a collapsing barn, a fortune, his grandfather's final confession, and an impossible choice. Keep the money and save the farm, or do what his grandfather never did, find the rightful owner and return what was stolen. The barn suddenly felt smaller, the walls pressing in, the weight of generations bearing down on his shoulders. There was no easy way out of this, and no matter what he chose, nothing would ever be the same again. Jacob sat frozen on the barn floor, the brittle letter trembling in his grip. The words on the page blurred as his mind reeled, struggling to process what he had just read. His entire life, everything he thought he knew about his grandfather, about this farm, about the legacy he had fought so hard to protect, had been built on a betrayal. The money was never meant to be his. He swallowed hard, his eyes flicking between the stacks of cash inside the safe and the faded ink on the letter. It could all end here. Every problem, every sleepless night worrying about losing the farm, every debt suffocating him, gone. The money could save him. It could fix everything. But it didn't belong to him. The realization settled in his chest like lead. His grandfather had stolen this fortune and hidden it away, convincing himself that silence was the same as redemption. He had carried that secret to his grave, leaving Jacob to bear the weight of his sins. Jacob clenched his fists, his jaw tightening. It wasn't fair. He had worked himself to the bone for this land. He had given everything to keep it afloat, to preserve his family's history, to hold on to something that now felt more like a burden than a blessing. He had bled for this farm. Didn't he deserve this chance? A bitter laugh escaped his lips. His grandfather must have asked himself the same question once. Jacob closed his eyes, inhaling deeply, forcing himself to push past the anger, past the exhaustion, past the desperation clawing at the edges of his resolve. This wasn't just about him. If the man his grandfather had stolen from was still alive, then he had spent decades living with nothing, unaware that everything he had lost had been locked away in this barn all along. Could Jacob live with himself knowing that? His fingers tightened around the letter. There was only one choice. With a slow, deliberate breath, he grabbed the stacks of money from the safe and placed them carefully inside a burlap sack. He folded the letter with steady hands, slipping it into his pocket. His body moved with a certainty his heart had not yet caught up to. By the time he stood, dust settling around his boots, he already knew what he had to do. The money didn't belong to this farm. It belonged to the past, and it was time to set it free. The sun hung low in the sky as Jacob stepped out of the barn, the weight of the burlap sack heavy in his grip. The air smelled of dry earth and the faint remnants of rain from the night before, but none of it felt the same. Nothing felt the same. The letter burned in his pocket, as if the words his grandfather had left behind had embedded themselves into his very skin. His pulse pounded in his ears, his breath unsteady. This was it. The choice was made. But the hardest part was still ahead. He had spent the last few hours digging through old town records, making calls, searching for any clue as to who his grandfather had stolen from. The name mentioned in the letter had been familiar, but only distantly. A ghost from a time before he was born. And then, finally, he had found something. The man's son still lived in the next town over. Jacob's truck rumbled down the dirt road, his fingers tightening on the wheel with every mile that passed. His mind raced with the possibilities. What if they didn't believe him? What if they thought he was lying? What if giving this money back didn't make a difference after all these years? Doubt gnawed at the edges of his resolve, whispering, all the reasons he should turn around, keep the money, pretend none of this had ever happened. But the truth was louder. This money wasn't his, and his grandfather's sins weren't his to carry. The house came into view, small but well kept, sitting at the edge of a quiet street. Jacob parked, his heart hammering against his ribs as he climbed out of the truck. The sack of money felt impossibly heavy now, as if it had taken on the weight of every stolen moment, every broken promise, every regret that had lived in his grandfather's chest until the day he died. He approached the door and knocked. Seconds stretched into eternity. Then the door creaked open. An older man stood before him, his eyes weathered, his face lined with the kind of grief that never fully fades. There was something about him, a quiet strength and unspoken pain, that told Jacob he had spent a lifetime carrying the loss of something he had never been able to name. Jacob swallowed hard. "Sir," he began, his voice rough, uncertain. He held up the sack. "I think this belongs to you." The man frowned, his gaze shifting between Jacob and the bag. "I don't understand." Jacob exhaled, his throat tightening. "My grandfather. I think he wronged your family a long time ago. He never made it right. I don't know if this fixes anything, but it's yours. It always was." Silence stretched between them, thick and fragile. The man's eyes flickered with something unreadable, something raw. He reached for the sack, hesitating before opening it, and when he saw what was inside, his breath hitched. Jacob watched as the man's fingers trembled against the worn fabric, his eyes darting between the money and the ground beneath them. He blinked rapidly, as if trying to process something too large, too impossible. His lips parted, but no words came. Jacob felt his own throat tighten. "I just thought you should know," he murmured. Someone remembered. Someone regretted. The man exhaled sharply, gripping the door frame for support. And then, to Jacob's surprise, tears filled his eyes. Not just sadness, relief, a history rewritten, a burden lifted, a truth finally set free. Jacob took a slow step back, feeling something loosen in his chest. The farm was still in trouble. His problems weren't magically solved, but as he walked back to his truck, the evening air cooler against his skin, he felt lighter than he had in years, because for the first time in a long time, he knew he had done the right thing, and sometimes that was worth more than money ever could be. Jacob sat in his truck staring at the house in his rearview mirror. The old man still stood in the doorway, gripping the sack of money like it was something fragile, something he couldn't quite believe was real. For a long time, Jacob had wondered what it felt like to finally be free of the weight pressing on his chest. He had thought that maybe, if he ever made the right choice, if he ever did something selfless, there would be a moment of pure clarity, some kind of divine relief washing over him like a baptism, cleansing him of every doubt, every hardship. But now, As he gripped the steering wheel, hands still unsteady, he realized that wasn't how life worked. The farm was still on the brink of collapse. His debts hadn't magically disappeared. His problems were still his to face one by one. And yet, something was different. The past no longer had its claws in him. The secret buried beneath his barn had finally been exhumed, no longer rotting in silence beneath the weight of guilt. He had done what his grandfather never could. As he pulled away from the house, the sun dipped lower, the sky painted in deep oranges and purples. The road ahead stretched into the horizon, uncertain as ever. But for the first time in a long time, Jacob wasn't afraid of what came next. When he arrived back at the farm, the land looked the same as when he had left it, dry, worn, struggling to survive just as he was. But now, as he stepped out of the truck, the wind carrying the scent of earth and rain, he saw it for what it really was, a chance, a new beginning. Jacob wasn't sure how he would save this place. Maybe he would find a way, or maybe he wouldn't. But for the first time, he understood that his family's legacy wasn't about the land itself, or even about survival. It was about honor, about doing the right thing, even when no one was watching. He walked toward the barn, the very place where this story had started, where the past had tried to hold him in its grip. But it had failed. Jacob stepped inside, breathing in the familiar scent of hay and old wood. He ran his hand along the workbench, just as his grandfather once had, and for the first time, he didn't feel resentment, only peace. The world hadn't changed, but he had, and sometimes that was enough.